it's Kayla, and this video is, I guess now, the second installment in my Blind Mom series, which I am really excited about. So if you missed my last video, I'm pregnant. I'm currently 24 weeks along. We are expecting a baby girl in June, which we're really excited about. But in this video, I wanted to talk about, I got a couple of questions from people asking if our baby will be blind. And so I wanted to answer that question today, and then also talk a little bit about if the answer to that question had any bearing on our decision to have children. So getting straight into it, the short answer of will our baby be blind is no. But of course, I have a long answer for you. So for the majority of my life, I didn't know the answer to this question of if my children would be blind or not, if I would pass this on. And it wasn't until a few years ago when I did genetic testing that I found out the answer to this question. And I actually made a video on my channel about my experience doing genetic testing, which I will link. But essentially, I have an eye disease called Leber's congenital amaurosis, which is a subtype of retinitis pigmentosa. And it is a mutation on my RDH12 gene. And this is a recessive genetic disorder. So I'm going to give a very basic, like high school biology lesson on genetics. I'm not a geneticist, it's going to be very simplified. So if you remember back to high school biology with the Punnett square, or if you want to Google Punnett square so you can follow along, every person has 2 copies of genes. You get 1 copy of genes from your mom and 1 copy of genes from your dad. And so there are dominant and recessive genes. Essentially, if you get 1 dominant gene and 1 recessive gene, you will present with the dominant gene. It kind of like dominates the recessive gene. The recessive gene, people are also called like carriers of that gene, which essentially you carry that gene around in your genetic code. It doesn't affect you, but it still is part of your genetic code. And so then you could pass that along. So essentially what is thought to have happened is, I'm going to call this the RDH12 gene, an R gene to simplify it. So essentially each of my parents had a good R and a bad R. So dad had good R, bad R, mom had good R, bad R. So when they got together and had kids, they had a 25% chance of both passing on their good R from mom, good R from dad. 50% chance of passing on a good R and a bad R from each of them, or like vice versa. That's why that's 50% and not 25. And then a 25% chance that they both pass on their bad R, which is what happened to me. So if you have 2 good R's, you're good to go. No LCA in your future. If you have a good R and a bad R, that good R dominates the bad R, and so you are then a carrier of LCA, but it doesn't affect you. But what I got is 2 bad R's, and so then I have the eye disease. So, but I do have a sister who is not affected, and so she either got 2 good R's and is completely not affected, or she got a good R and a bad R, and therefore she is a carrier, which could impact her future children if she chose to have them. So I hope all that made sense. I hope that was a good explanation. But neither one of my parents were aware that they were carriers of this disorder, because nobody in my family ever has had this eye disease or anything like it. And I have a very large family, so you'd think that it would have shown up. And so neither one of them were aware that they were carriers, and it's because it's a rare thing to be a carrier of. And so it's just really uncommon that someone is a carrier of this gene mutation. And so the odds of 2 people with that carry that same mutation get together and have babies is very rare. So after I got my genetic test done, the next step would be to get Ethan's genetic test done. So they tested his R gene, and he has 2 good R's. So he's not affected by this, and he's also not a carrier. And so that means our children will not be affected by my eye disease. Now, they will be carriers. So back to our Punnett square. If Ethan has 2 good R's and I have 2 bad R's, the only combination our children are going to have is 1 good R, 1 bad R. 1 good R from Ethan, 1 bad R from me, because that's all either of us have. That's the only combination that can exist. So it's 100% chance that our children, all of our children, will have 1 good R, 1 bad R. And so none of them should be affected, but they all will be carriers. And so that will be something for them to evaluate when they have children, if they choose to, and maybe they want their partners to get tested as well to know if their partners are carriers. But to add a caveat, anyone in the world could have a visually impaired or blind child, because even though this is not in our genetic makeup, we're not going to pass anything down, there are still things that could go wrong in development or during birth that could cause an array of any issues. And so nobody is ever guaranteed that they won't have a blind child, but we are at no higher risk than the average person of having a blind child. And in fact, you could argue that we're at a little bit lower risk because we've done genetic testing and we know that there's nothing like hiding in the family tree that we're carrying around that we're unaware of that our baby could potentially end up with. And we actually did genetic testing before starting IVF because it's very routine, and we got genetic testing for like a whole host of things. And it's actually common, like the average person carries about 3 recessive disorders. That's pretty average. But the important thing is that your partner doesn't carry the same 3 or 4 recessive disorders, which is the case or the case for us, which I think is really interesting. Like one of us was a carrier for cystic fibrosis. I don't remember which one, but it didn't really matter because the other one of us was not a carrier. And so cystic fibrosis is one of those things that it's more common. Like a lot more people have heard of cystic fibrosis than have heard of Leber's congenital amaurosis, because it's a lot more common for people to be carriers of CF. And so like if there's more people in the population carrying that recessive gene, then the odds of 2 people out of that pool getting together and having babies is a lot more common than mine, which is a lot more rare to carry. So if it's just a few people in the population that are carrying that, the odds of them 2 people finding each other and having kids together is very rare. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that segment of biology with Kayla. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about how much this had a bearing on our decision to have children, because like I mentioned, for a very long time, I didn't know the answer to this question. And in fact, I would always ask at my yearly eye appointments, every time, what are the odds of me passing this on to my children? I was asking that since I was like 12. While most 12-year-olds are worried about like their soccer game the next day, I was worried about, was my eye disease going to be passed down to my children 10 or 20 years in the future? And my doctors didn't know. I got answers ranging between 1 in a million to 50-50. And that's a really big range. So essentially, they had no idea. And so I had no idea if I was going to pass this along to my children. And there was never a question about if I was going to have children or not. Like I knew that I wanted to be a mom. I joke that I have had baby fever my entire life, which is not really a joke. It is true. I have had baby fever my entire life. I've always known that I wanted to be a mom. And even though I did have concerns about passing this on to my children, or concerns about it being difficult being a blind mom, or I had concerns about how I would do certain things or handle certain situations as a blind mom, it was never a question to me of should I have kids or not because I'm blind. It was always like, I know this is what I want out of my life, and you only get one life, and so this is what I'm going to do because this is really important to me, and it may be hard, and I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to make it work. So it was never a question of if I was going to become a parent, but more the avenue to how. And so when me and Ethan were dating, we had a lot of discussions, and we actually decided that we were going to adopt. And there were 3 reasons why we made this decision. A, because of the uncertainty of if this would be passed on to our children. B, is that I thought my body physically could not handle pregnancy or childbirth. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. And then the third reason, which wasn't as strong as the other 2, but still a factor, was I wasn't sure if or how much vision I would lose while being pregnant, because my disorder can be really affected by hormones. There are some people who say that they have lost a lot of vision during pregnancy, and there are some that say that they've lost none, and everywhere in between. And so that was another thing that was a big uncertainty too. So we had these 3 reasons, and if it was just one of any of those 3, I don't know that we would have made the same decision. But since there were all 3, which all felt like really good reasons to maybe not have our own biological children, we decided that adoption was the best route for us. So very shortly after we got married, we went to an informational meeting at an adoption agency. I was eager to start the process because I knew that it could take a really long time. And so I was eager to just get that ball rolling. And at that meeting, we found out that you had to be married for at least 2 years before you could start the process. And so I was really discouraged about that. I was like, I was already thinking this was going to take forever, and now we've got to wait another 2 years before we even start the process. That was very discouraging, but that was still our plan. So we were just like, okay, we're going to wait. So during that 2 years, I started doing research about adoption. I joined some adoption Facebook groups, and I started to get cold feet. There's so much that I could go into, but as a social worker, I see all of the issues with just the whole system of adoption, and also adoption trauma for children who have been adopted, and there's just a lot more that I'm going to go into. But the thing that I was most concerned about was that I was afraid that nobody would pick us because I'm blind. There's a statistic. I think it's that for every infant that is placed for adoption, there are 30 waiting couples. And so I was like, if there's 30 couples per every baby being placed for adoption, and birth moms have all these people they could pick from, why would they pick me? Why would they pick the blind mom? And so I was afraid that it was either going to just take forever, or that it would never happen for us. And so it was something that I was really concerned about. And I know there are other avenues for adopting children, but I wanted the baby stage. I was not willing to budge on that. So I wanted to do an infant adoption. And so I just started having a lot of concerns about adoption for a lot of reasons. And I was talking to my therapist about it. And she asked me, why are we wanting to adopt if it didn't seem like I was really wanting to adopt? And so I explained to her our reasonings. And so when I got to the part where I said I didn't feel like my body could physically handle pregnancy and childbirth because I have a really low pain tolerance, and my body is just really weak, and I feel like my body is just going to give out and I'm going to die during childbirth. That was my thought. My body would just give out and I would die during childbirth. And my therapist was like, I don't know that that's accurate. That sounds like a phobia. And that was just a light bulb moment of, okay, maybe this actually isn't real. Maybe I made this up in my mind, that my body's just going to give out and I'm going to die. And maybe this is a phobia. So that kind of unlocked me questioning maybe we could do this. Maybe we could have our own children. So I talked about it somewhere in therapy. I learned about what is called a blood injection injury phobia. And so what I, my entire life, had classified as a low pain tolerance, because during painful episodes or during medical procedures, I have been known to faint or feel very faint, and I thought that was a low pain tolerance, my body just like giving out under the pain. It turns out that is an anxiety response. The fainting was an anxiety response, not because my body physically can't handle the pain. So that was very interesting to learn. And then it felt like, well, this is something I can do something about. This is something I can work on. I can work on my anxiety. I can work on my phobia. And maybe I can physically handle this, and I'm not just going to up and die during childbirth. So then, since that kind of was not one of our components anymore to consider adoption, also by that point, I had already lost so much vision. The concern about losing vision during pregnancy wasn't really as much of an issue, because it was like I really didn't have a whole lot else to lose. So that didn't really seem as big of a factor. And then so we just had the one factor left, which was, were we going to pass this down? Which is when I decided to get genetic testing. And so when we found out that that was not a factor either, because we weren't going to pass it on, then we were like, okay, let's have our own baby. And so that was an exciting thing to, I guess, to just realize that, like, actually we can do this. And the things that I was worried about maybe aren't as big of concerns as I thought. And so now here we are, having our own baby. So yeah, I guess that's all I have for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it answered y'all's questions. If you have any other questions for me, feel free to leave those in the comments below. I would love to answer them in a future video. And I will see you next time.